Hi, my name is Timothy Barr, and the paper that I was going to present at the American Society for the History of Rhetoric Symposium was about enthusiasm, specifically the figure of the enthusiast in English Baroque rhetoric. And for the purposes of this paper and slightly strange term Baroque, we're just going to use it as a period marker from roughly 1650 into the early 18th century. Enthusiasm, as we hear it now, we typically mean excitement, happiness of some kind, anticipation. We are hearing about voter enthusiasm as a kind of predictive measure for the success of a candidate in an election. Enthusiasm in the 17th century had a very different connotation, and it was caught up in ideas about melancholy, which also has a very different connotation. And initially, we think about those two together, melancholy as kind of reminding us of depressive affect, and enthusiasm as engaged affect. They almost seem like potentially opposites. So what was the big problem with enthusiasm? Enthusiasm was a subject position carved out in order to describe more than just this, but especially this. People who are claiming to have immediate access to divine revelation. So a position in a discourse related to a kind of truth. And there was already ideas about, of course, people who were counterfeiting, false prophets, scriptural passages that talked about false prophets. So people who were pretending to have revelation but did not. And of course, there were ideas about madness, of people who were truly mad. Enthusiasm is interesting and distinct, and it's related to ideas of melancholy, because in treatises by Merritt Casaubon and Henry Moore, these two earlier treatises, they tried to create a position where we said that this person who was claiming to be divinely inspired genuinely did believe that they were. However, they were not mad. They had a disease of the imagination, or something that would allow their reason to be intact. So it created a new position, a new subject position, one could say, for a relationship between a speaker and truth. And that in itself, I think, is something that's interesting, because when one of the legacies of the field of the history of rhetoric certainly would go back to Foucault's work on the relationship between various kinds of subject positions, even though that's a little bit of a démodé term now, but those subject positions that are the relationship between a speaker and truth. And in his later Collège de France lectures about the parrhésiast, we see an interest in that ancient position of someone who was going to speak in some, for lack of a better term, truth to power, which was what some of the enthusiasts were doing and was getting them into some trouble, especially the Quakers. But the enthusiast is a different position both than that parrhésiast and one of Foucault's other interests, the mad person, that allowed reason to remain intact. And it became, through that latter half of the 17th century and into the 18th century, a really important way for thinking in the English political context about the acceptable bounds and limits of religious and political speech, for which there was not a clear boundary at the time. And we see interest in the idea of enthusiasm in figures like John Locke, who devotes a chapter to it towards the end of his essay on human understanding. And for Locke, enthusiasm is a kind of self-persuasion, where we persuade ourselves of something as opposed to being persuaded by the proofs that support the claim or revelation that comes through scripture, authorized revelation. And so we see the diminishment of the value of the figure of the enthusiast also allows them to exist without them being necessarily someone who's deceitful. They're just someone who has made a grievous error, but also that kind of position has to be tested against the claims of reason and, for Locke, scripture. There's a lot of other interesting things here, I think, for the history of rhetoric, one of which would be the way in which the figure of the enthusiast relates to a kind of naturalization of style. For instance, Henry Moore, in his discourse on this, Enthusiasmus Triumphatus, the enthusiast has been triumphed over at the end of Moore's discourse. He says that when blood is mixed with melancholy, you can find this in someone's language, which is very sweet and melting, as if sugar plums lay under their tongue. And so we see an interesting way in which a medical concept about someone's disposition relates to some recognition of the kind of style that they have. So a tumid or swollen style, lots of ornamentation, is no longer seen as something that is some kind of artifice, but actually arising out of someone's temperament. And there's almost a kind of rhetorical diagnosis that's happening in these cases. Merrick Casaubon's treatise goes into far greater depth about this. And in fact, he devotes an entire chapter in his work on enthusiasm to rhetorical enthusiasm. And it is really expansive and an interesting document. Not only is he concerned with the way that people become convinced that they themselves are inspired poetically or rhetorically. He talks about poetry in the following chapter, so there's some difference between them. But people become inspired by rhetoric because they can't see themselves how the idea that they are speaking about came to them. And he gives many, many examples of this. But he also talks about the way that enthusiasm can be produced by rhetoric. And he looks at the musicality of speech, and he thinks about the number of a word, that it has a certain kind of rhythm to it, which he distinguishes from meter, that words themselves have rhythm, as well as metaphor and imagery, and these kinds of things that give us a sense, an actual sensibility of something that gives us the feeling that we are transported. And that sublimity, and he's of course referring here to many places. He's a philologist, so he has lots of ancient texts that he's bringing in here. But Longinus and Perihoupsos, or On the Sublime, is one of the texts he talks about here of how rhetorical enthusiasm is produced. And that relates to, I think, another one of the takeaways for thinking about enthusiasm in this period, which is how social affections can be produced through rhetoric. And in many ways, it comes from a kind of failure of the audience. And that's pretty old idea. You could maybe even trace that back to Aristotle or even further back in time. But one of the things that I become really interested in the figure of the enthusiast, and for me really is the most interesting, is that the enthusiast is someone who is persuading themselves of something, but they're persuading themselves of something mostly because they cannot see the reasons for why something is appearing to them in their minds. So they get some kind of insight that comes suddenly. One of the examples is Jakob Böhme, or Behmann, who is a German language mystic who has a kind of certain slant of light that hits a silver tray at a certain moment of the day. And at that moment, he has these ideas about divinity that come to him. And many, many, many of these examples are cited in the works that I'm referencing here. But at the same time, we see the discourse on enthusiasm pushing those ideas outside of civic discourse, that those are not things that need to be worried about because they are simply enthusiasm. However, at the same time, we have the kind of conclusion of the paper is the turn to Shaftesbury letter on enthusiasm, in which enthusiasm gets, in some sense, recovered as a kind of joking style that actually does become embedded in the civil discourse, the civil style of the English, especially the English Whig Party, the emerging parliamentary discourse. So for Shaftesbury, the idea here is that gravity leads to deceit. The people who take on a kind of heavy manner, people who are always very serious, that they need to be tested with ridicule. So ridicule is what is going to become a way of lancing the gravity of speech that comes from people who are either self-deluding or actively deceitful. And so we see a kind of transformation of a concern with people who are claiming revelation to any kind of concern, any kind of stylistic concern with people who trying to be too serious. And so both in the context of the history of English political style and rhetorical style, we see that enthusiasm kind of traces a short genealogy across the long 18th century, one might say. beginning in the 17th century of what is appropriate style for civic discourse. And at the same time, we see its origins in the concerns about the religious disputes, the nature of reason, and the kinds of passions that are rightly grounded in rhetoric and those that are falsely grounded in beliefs about divine inspiration.